Namaste everyone and welcome to another session on mad-Bhagavadgi. Today we will research chapter 6 verses 7 to 10 from my book A Seeker's Bhagavad-Gita. I request you to please take a look at it and give me your feedback. The self-controlled, tranquil, supreme soul is equipoised in cold and heat, happiness or sadness, as well as honor and dishonor. It is said that the soul, which is secured in the knowledge of the self and surrounding, and has attained unshakable victory over the senses and harmonized itself, that yogi views everything as gold. So, what is Sri Krishna trying to say? In the first instance, it's important for us to understand what is a self controlled, tranquil, supreme soul, equipoised in cold and heat, happiness or sadness, as well as honor or dishonor. Whenever we act, the driver of action is generally passion or reaction to a stimulus. So it is either coming from within us or it is a reaction to somebody giving us a stimulus. When this happens, generally we are defending a position or we are having an expectation of an outcome. Both of these have a consequence. Whenever we are defending a position, we are actually defending our sense of identity. Because that sense of identity is the one that drives the position that we take. So, from our sense of identity comes our conditioning. From that conditioning comes the situation in which we are in, and from that situation comes the stand that we take on any situation. When that happens and somebody gives us a feedback, if it is a positive feedback, our sense of self expands. If it is a negative feedback, our sense of self contracts. We recede into ourselves. That is the first part. The first part is when we have an internal need that comes from desire. The desire to possess something. Sometimes we think of the consequences, sometimes we don't think of the consequences. Most of the time, whether we think of the consequences or we don't think of the consequences, we cannot control the outcome. So, the drive for an outcome starts with an expectation. When that expectation is not met, we are always happy or sad, or we feel that it's good or bad, or we have a like or a dislike with the object. This results in us bringing the other object closer to us or pushing it away, resulting in karma with consequent debt, which we then have to repay. So, this is the first situation. The second situation is when we are responding to a stimulus. When we respond to a stimulus, what happens is that there is an expectation upon us, and that expectation has to be faced off with our sense of identity. It goes to our sense of identity or asmita. On top of the asmita is our dharma or conditioning, and on top of that is the situation we face ourselves in. These layers then contribute to the way we respond. In that situation also, either we like or we dislike the source of the stimulus. If we like the source of the stimulus, we bring the source closer to us. If we dislike the source of the stimulus, we push it away. Both of these are relative movements between us and the object. That results in karma, which again results in an imbalance, which results in a debt which we have to repay. However, if we are tranquil and equipoised in cold and heat, happiness and sadness, if our response is one which is equal in both happiness and sadness, we don't have an expectation, we just accept whatever comes our way, then what happens is that no karma is created. When no karma is created, then you are in a state of null. And this is what Sri Krishna is trying to say in verse 7 of chapter 6. The self-controlled, tranquil, supreme soul is equipoised in cold and heat, happiness or sadness, as well as honor or dishonor. In both, whenever there is an internal drive to get something or whenever there is a response to stimulus. Now let us look at verse 8. It is said that the soul which is secure in the knowledge of the self And surrounding has attained unshakable victory over the senses and harmonized itself. And the yogi views everything as gold. What Sri Krishna is explaining here is how can that be done? How can we achieve this equipoise? We can achieve this equipoise when the soul has understood the nature of the self. If you would have noticed in verse 5 and 6, he was talking about the soul conquering the soul. What does that mean? We are constantly transacting with the environment. When we transact with the environment, what happens is we are constantly creating karma. However, when we start listening to the Guru soul that is within us, there is less of clutter or noise or turbulence between the transactions and ourselves. Slowly, when we begin to drive our transactions using the Guru soul or the conscience or whatever we want to call it, when this self is secure within the self, then what happens is that there is equipoise. We do not get disturbed in any situation, nor do we act when we are disturbed or in a disturbed condition. So this is what Sri Krishna is trying to say in these two verses. Sri Krishna also explains to us how this control of the self or the knowledge of the self can be attained. And here he speaks of the control over the senses. So we have the sense of sight, the smell, the ears, the touch, the taste. All of these are more or less concentrated around the head. And the center of cognition, where all these senses are collated, is the manas. The manas, if you can stabilize it, then what happens is that the transactional soul is no longer getting disturbed by its situation. Because at the end of the day, no matter what stimulus comes to you or what internal drive you have, if you can control the way you act. So when we receive the stimulus, we use the five jnanendriyas, that is the sight, smell, and others. When we act, we use our hands, our legs, our tongue, and other things. So if we can control both, if we control the center of cognition, both the action as well as the reaction elements come under our control. This is what Sri Krishna is trying to explain when he speaks about us achieving unshakable victory over the senses. And the last aspect, which is a very critical aspect, is how can we get equipoise? When we control the senses, when the transactional self is controlled by the guru self, the ones that the self that is within us, when that happens, then what happens is that we are equipoise. We are in a state of equipoise. And when that state of equipoise happens, then we begin to view everything in the same manner. That is samadrishti, that is equal gaze. We don't have prejudice. The bias within us begins to recede and comes to zero. Like for instance, some of us would say a Mercedes Benz is better than a Maruti, a Mercedes Benz is better than a Ford, a Toyota, all that will go. For us, it will end up becoming a car. It does not matter, it is just a car. And when you sit inside it, it will be a car and nothing else. That is precisely what Sri Krishna is trying to say in these two verses 7 and 8. Now, let us research verse 9 and 10. One who is always in a state of undisturbed intellect with friends, allies, enemies, those who are sad, lawyers, the odious, relatives, mendicants, or sinners, always excels. Verse 10. Let the yogi in solitude maintain a constant and steady soul, alone, with a soul whose consciousness has no hope and is free from greed. So let us look at these two verses in greater detail. Let us look at how we can remove attachment from sense objects and the drive of the will. So as we have seen before, there is a sentient interface. The sentient interface gathers the data. That is, the sense organs grab the data using the various senses, and this is collated. This is then compared in the buddhi with our conditioning. Sri Krishna is talking about this particular state of buddhi. What happens at the buddhi level? That is, at the buddhi level, the data that has come in is now being compared with our conditioning. When there is a difference in the conditioning and the data that has come in, we have what is called a triggering of a fight or flight experience. We begin to see whether there is going to be a threat to us. If there is a threat perception, then we begin to take compensatory action. Now, this comes because of the way we are, our sense of identity, the fragile sense of identity, which is all the time trying to defend itself. So, the buddhi is where the comparison happens. The data comes in, we have a conditioning, the data is then compared with our conditioning. When that conditioning comparison happens, the amygdala is triggered, and the amygdala then triggers the HP axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenaline axis. This then disturbs what is called homeostasis, the equilibrium within the body. So ultimately what Sri Krishna is talking about is a state of homeostasis, where we are in continuous state of equipoise. Let us look at the problem from the solution. In order that we should remain in homeostasis, it means that there should be no adrenaline in our system, no cortisol in our system. That means that the HP axis should not be triggered. That means that the memory, the amygdala, everything should be in complete equipoise. For that to happen, the comparison of the incoming data should not trigger any sense of fear or threat. For that to happen, we should have an internal anchor, the guru, which is so strong that it is not getting disturbed by any stimulus that comes to us. And that happens at the buddhi level. The buddhi is the one that is doing the comparison of the incoming stimulus with our sense of identity. So, the transactional identity, which is taking in the data, which is collating the data and comparing the data, then needs to have a very strong anchor. If there is a very strong anchor which is not getting disturbed by the amount of information that is coming in, then automatically the response is going to be an equipoise. There is going to be no stimulus to the rest of the system within the body, and so we will continue to remain in a state of homeostasis. Stasis essentially means equipoise. We remain in the same state. We don't change our state. So there is thermodynamic equilibrium. This is what Sri Krishna is trying to say. That if we are able to reach that stage where we do not get disturbed, when we can control our sense organs, when the stimulus comes in, then we do not get disturbed and react without getting upset by good or bad. Now let us look at the next question. Let the yogi in solitude maintain a constant and steady soul alone, with the soul whose consciousness has no hope and is free from greed. Now let's look at what we mean by let the yogi maintain a steady and constant soul. One lesson that we can immediately understand is that you have to reduce the interaction you have with the environment. If we reduce the interactions we have with the environment, what happens is that the amount of stimulus that we need to manage becomes reduced. That means choose your battles. If we minimize the number of battles we have to fight, the system gets the elasticity with which it can manage the incoming data. So, the first rule is try to reduce the number of interactions you have with the external environment. That means you have to be in solitude. When we are in solitude, another thing happens. We begin to build the internal capacity to absorb the fluctuations of information that come in. When we are in solitude, when we practice meditation, we build up the reservoir of undisturbed consciousness within ourselves. So every time we have a transaction, it may bleed a little, but it will not shift the overall balance within ourselves. So the first thing is the solitude does two things. One is it reduces the number of data points that come to us that we have to manage. And the second thing it does is it builds up the reserves and surplus that we have within ourselves of our cognitive capability. This makes us unshakable. So that means that the transaction consciousness, the transaction self, is now slowly receding into the guru self or the actual self. When that happens, the consciousness begins to act without hope. That means you act without expectation of good, bad, right, and wrong. And in the internal drive, or when we do something ourselves, we do that particular action without greed, without a need for an outcome. So, coming back to the original statement we made before, there are two reasons why we act. One is an internal drive, and the second is a response to stimulus. When the consciousness is in equipoise, that is, when we have built the reservoir of placid consciousness, then what happens is, first, when we act without hope or greed. That is the first part. And the second part is when we receive stimulus, we are not disturbed because we are not acting with an intention of an outcome, nor are we viewing the other person with any form of with any bias. These are the key lessons to be learned from these four verses. Yoga is the movement of the cognition from turbulence to stillness, from cacophony to silence, from sense of doership or ahankara to inertness. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. For more information, please do visit my website www.schoolofyoga.in.